A soldier's solitude is shattered when an old life reappears at the edge of the wilderness. With only his dog by his side, the fight to stay hidden becomes a battle for survival when a deeper, darker truth is uncovered. As the past claws its way into the present, one man must choose whether to run again or face the consequences of the secrets he's kept. Intrigued? Drop a like, subscribe, and let me know where you're tuning in from. I'd love to hear your predictions. Thaddeus Cross had come to the farthest edge of Washington state to disappear. The locals didn't know his story, and that was the point. To them, he was just another quiet black man living by the sea, a veteran who bought supplies in silence and nodded without small talk. The ocean's gray roar matched the static in his mind, steady, relentless, unforgiving. He'd built his cabin from reclaimed timber on a bluff near the Olympic Peninsula, a place where the fog rolled in thick enough to hide from the world. It was here that the former Navy SEAL, once trained to hunt ghosts in war zones, now tried to outrun his own. But solitude had its limits, and Thaddeus wasn't alone. His only companion was Harlem, a battle-trained German shepherd with a black saddle coat and eyes the color of whiskey. Harlem wasn't a pet, he was a partner. They had survived more ambushes than either cared to count, and the dog's loyalty had pulled Thaddeus through more nights than prayer ever had. Harlem didn't ask questions. He didn't pity. He simply stayed. Their days followed a rhythm carved by habit: rise before dawn, grind coffee by hand. Listen to the Pacific's breath beyond the window. Then came the walks, the part that reminded Thaddeus he was still alive. Harlem trotted ahead through mist and cedar ears, always scanning tail low, but steady. It was routine, comfortable, predictable until that morning. The sky was bruised gray, the kind that never fully turned to daylight. Thaddeus's breath hung in front of him like steam. Harlem moved at his usual pace until halfway down the beach, the dog stopped dead. His entire body stiffened. One paw lifted midair, head turned sharply towards the forest that shadowed the coastline. Thaddeus slowed, scanning the fog. "What is it, boy?" he murmured. Harlem didn't move. Then came the bark, short, sharp, guttural. A sound Thaddeus hadn't heard since Kandahar, the bark that meant something's wrong. The hair along Harlem's neck rose like static. "Easy," Thaddeus said, but the dog ignored him, lowering his body into a hunter's crouch. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that didn't belong. Smoke faint, but distinct, cutting through the salt and pine. Thaddeus inhaled again to be sure. Smoke this far north wasn't uncommon, but this smell was wrong. It wasn't campfire smoke. It was metallic, desperate, the scent of wet wood forced to burn. Harlem let out a low growl, the kind that vibrated through the ground. "You smell it too." Thaddeus muttered, his pulse quickening. He glanced towards the tree line. The fog was thick enough to swallow a man whole, but he could make out faint flickers between the trunk's light, or maybe reflection. He tried to tell himself to turn back. The forest wasn't his problem, but something old inside him stirred the same instinct that had saved lives in places where hesitation killed. Harlem looked back at him, once his amber eyes sharp with meaning. "Follow me." Without another word, the dog stepped off the trail and vanished into the undergrowth. Thaddeus cursed softly and went after him. The forest closed around them like a secret. Ferns brushed his knees, wet from the morning drizzle, and the smell of moss was thick enough to taste. Every sound mattered. Hear the soft thud of Harlem's paws ahead, the drip of water from branches, the distant heartbeat of the surf. It was too familiar, too much like the jungles he trained in years ago. The rhythm of danger was back, thrumming beneath his ribs. Harlem moved fast but careful, pausing every few yards to check the wind. He wasn't chasing, he was tracking. Thaddeus followed his senses, sharpening with each step. The smoke smell grew stronger, mingling with something else, something sour, like sickness or decay. He gripped the handle of his knife, the one piece of gear he never left behind, its weight grounding him. "Harlem," he whispered, The dog stopped ahead and gave a short, low whine. Then through the veil of fog, Thaddeus saw a slant of gray roof pressed against a rock wall. It was barely visible until they were nearly on top of it, a cabin half swallowed by moss and shadow. Whoever had built it had wanted it hidden. The door was closed, but crooked the chimney, breathing weak, uneven smoke that drifted like a dying signal. Harlem stood motionless in front of it, tail down, body rigid. His growl deepened into something uncertain, not anger, not threat, concern. Thaddeus scanned the perimeter, no footprints, no tracks, no sign of recent passage, yet the smoke was new. He circled the clearing, every nerve awake, every instinct telling him this was wrong. The woods pressed close, quiet, as if waiting. He looked at Harlem again. The dog's ears flicked back once, then forward, then he let out a single soft bark, the signal they'd used in war to say someone's alive in there. Thaddeus exhaled slowly. He'd come here to vanish, to live small and unnoticed. But fate had a cruel way of reminding men like him that peace was never permanent. "All right," he muttered, stepping closer. The smell from the chimney was stronger now, wood. Yes, but underneath it, something human sweat, illness, desperation. The door groaned wider as Thaddeus Cross stepped into the gloom, the beam of his small flashlight slicing through dust and shadow. The cabin smelled like wood smoke sickness, and something older fear baked into the walls. Harlem moved first, his paws silent against the warped floorboards, nose low, body taut, but unthreatening. Thaddeus followed in a half-crouch, sweeping the light across the small one-room interior. It wasn't abandoned. A weak fire burned in a stone hearth, its smoke curling lazily through a crack in the chimney. On a cot by the far wall, half buried in thin blankets, lay a woman. Her skin was slick with sweat, her lips pale, and her breathing shallow enough to vanish between each rise and fall. Beside her sat a small girl, no older than 5 or 6, dark-haired, hollow-eyed, her body coiled in silent defense. The instant the light hit them, the girl moved. With trembling arms, she reached under the cot and pulled out a pistol nearly the size of her forearm, her hands shaking from the effort, but her aim fixed with surprising steadiness. "Don't," Thaddeus said, quietly lowering the light and raising one hand in open calm. "I'm not here to hurt you." His voice, deep and rough, carried the steady weight of command he hadn't used in years. The girl didn't blink. Her eyes, wide and glassy, flicked between him and Harlem. The dog had frozen mid-step, ears forward, but tail low, sensing the child's terror. Thaddeus kept his distance, speaking softly, the way he'd once talked to frightened civilians during nighttime evacuations. "Easy now," he said. "You'll hurt yourself before you hurt anyone." The girl's small arms trembled. Then a sound broke the standoff, a faint rasping whisper from the cot. "Please," the woman murmured, her voice raw and broken. "He's not one of them. Put it down." The girl hesitated, glancing toward the voice. "Please, Maris," the woman whispered again, her eyes fluttering open to reveal the fevered gray blue of exhaustion. The name lingered in the air. Maris. The pistol wavered, then slowly dropped to the floor with a soft clatter. Harlem exhaled a low whine of relief and stepped closer, his head tilted in that gentle, almost human way that always disarmed fear. "It's okay," Thaddeus said quietly. "Nobody's gonna hurt you." The girl stepped back, clutching her mother's blanket, her small chest heaving. Thaddeus approached the cot, careful not to make sudden moves. The woman looked young, late 20s maybe, but illness had stolen most of her vitality. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her skin shone with the pale wax of fever. She tried to push herself upright, failed, and fell back with a weak gasp. "Don't move," Thaddeus said, kneeling beside her. "You're burning up." She gave a faint laugh that turned into a cough. No kidding. Her voice was thin, but laced with something he recognized: grit. "Name's Thaddeus Cross," he said. "That's Harlem. We live down near the inlet. My dog found your smoke." The woman's eyes flicked toward Harlem, who sat beside the girl, letting her tiny hand rest on his head. "He found us." she whispered, her tone softening. Guess fate still has a cruel sense of humor. Thaddeus studied her face, the subtle tension beneath the sickness. She wasn't just ill, she was afraid. Every time a log cracked in the fire, she flinched. How long you been here? He asked. 3 days, she whispered. Or 4. I can't tell anymore. Her gaze drifted toward the door. We were running. We thought we'd made it far enough. Thaddeus caught the shift in her eyes, the flicker of panic behind the fever. He'd seen it before in refugees and soldiers and people who knew they were being hunted. Who's after you? He asked quietly. Her hand clutched the edge of the blanket knuckles white. Please, she said, her breath trembling. Just help her, my daughter. Maris had pressed herself into Harlem's side, now her small fingers tangled in his fur. The dog didn't move, his presence a silent promise of safety. Thaddeus reached for his canteen and held it out. Drink slow, he told the woman. She obeyed, sipping weakly, her throat working with visible pain. I have a cabin a few miles down the beach, he said. Clean water, supplies, antibiotics. You need more than a fire to beat that fever. Her eyes widened, the pupils tightening. No, she rasped. We can't go. He'll find us. Who Thaddeus pressed, but she turned her face toward the wall, refusing. You wouldn't believe me, she whispered. The girl's small voice, hoarse and fragile, answered instead. The man from the pictures. It was the first thing Maris had said, and the way she said it froze Thaddeus in place. He crouched lower to meet her eyes. What pictures, sweetheart? She pointed shakily toward a half-open satchel near the cot. Thaddeus pulled it closer, unzipped it slowly, and found a stack of laminated ID cards, a few $100 bills, and beneath them, a small framed photo. A man in a tailored suit smiled out at the camera, flanked by a marble building. The face was polished, controlled, but the eyes were empty. Thaddeus had seen eyes like that before, eyes that gave orders others carried out. He turned the frame over. Scratched into the metal backing were initials and a date, JP0914. He looked back at the woman. JP, he said. That who you're running from? Her throat tightened. She nodded once. Jonas Price. She whispered, her voice trembling around the name. He'll never stop. The sound of wind swept through the chimney, carrying a low moan that made the girl flinch. Thaddeus's mind clicked into motion. He'd heard the name before, a billionaire defense contractor, CEO of Price Biotechnics, known for private security contracts overseas. He had the resources to erase people, and suddenly the woman's fear made perfect sense. The night grew colder as the weak fire burned low, the small cabin creaking under the weight of the wind. Thaddeus Cross sat near the door, his back against the rough timber, watching the woman, Calla Wynne, fight for breath. Her fever had dipped slightly, but her strength was still threadbare. Beside her, little Maris slept curled against Harlem's side, the dog's rhythmic breathing soothing her small body, his warmth guarding her from the chill that slipped through the cracks. Thaddeus hadn't closed his eyes. His instincts never allowed it. The forest outside whispered, and every snap of a twig felt like a loaded trigger. He'd been in too many places where quiet meant danger was watching. His thoughts wouldn't stop circling the same question: who exactly were these two? And why would a man like Jonas Price send killers after them? The smoke rising from the hearth glowed faintly orange, lighting Calla's face in flashes, showing a woman who'd been beautiful once, but now looked carved from exhaustion and willpower. When she stirred, Thaddeus leaned forward. "You need to rest," he said quietly. Her cracked lips curled faintly. "I've been resting too long." Her voice rasped like gravel, and the words carried the weary edge of someone who'd been running for too long to remember what stillness felt like. She tried to push herself upright, but he steadied her shoulder gently. "Don't," he said. "You'll fall over before you finish a sentence." She gave a tired smile. "You talk like a soldier. Used to be one," he said, his voice even. "A long time ago." Her eyes met his gray blue, and sharp, despite the fever's fog. "You're not the kind who forgets." He didn't answer. The silence between them was heavy, but not hostile. It was the silence of two people who recognized damage in each other. Finally, she swallowed and said, "We were in Seattle. I worked for Price's company, Logistics Communications. Thought I was just managing paperwork. Turns out I was helping him move something worse." Thaddeus waited. She coughed again and looked toward her daughter. He called it a clinical trial, said it would change brain chemistry for veterans with PTSD. He was lying. He was testing chemical obedience. It worked on rats first, then on people. Thaddeus felt the words hit like cold water down his spine. "You mean experiments," he said. "Illegal ones." Calla nodded weakly. He needed test subjects no one would miss. Orphan street kids, a few veterans without family, and when one of them died, he made it look like suicide. She stopped the weight of it stealing her breath. "I found proof. I took the files. I ran." Thaddeus rubbed his temples slowly, processing the storm gathering in his head. "And the girl?" he asked softly. Calla looked toward her daughter, who stirred slightly in her sleep. "Maris isn't my blood," she whispered, "but she's mine all the same. Price had her mother killed when she threatened to go to the press. I couldn't leave her. I couldn't let him take her back." She closed her eyes and leaned back. "He'll never stop. He's got men in the police federal agencies everywhere. If you call anyone, we're dead before morning." The plea in her voice was raw and trembling. "Please don't call them. Not anyone." Thaddeus exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting to Harlem. The dog was watching him quietly, amber eyes reflecting the firelight, as if already understanding the decision that had to be made. He'd seen plenty of corruption in his time, but this was something uglier than war. "You think I'm about to hand you over?" he asked. Calla shook her head faintly. "You don't know what men like him can do. I've met men like him," Thaddeus replied, his tone flat but certain. "And I'm still here." She studied him for a long moment, then whispered Cross. "You said your name was Cross." He nodded, cautious. Something changed in her face, a flicker of faint disbelief, then realization. "You were in Ramadi," she said softly. "You guarded the embassy. My father was in that building, Director Wynn." Thaddeus blinked. The memory came sharp and unwanted. A bombed-out road dust gunfire, and a tall, graying man who'd refused to leave his post until the last staffer was safe. When Thaddeus murmured, "That was years ago. He died 2 years later." Calla said, her voice faltering. "Heart attack," they said. "But I think Price made sure it happened after Dad started investigating one of his contracts." She coughed again, her eyes glistening. "When I saw you at the door, I almost didn't believe it. He used to talk about you, about how a man named Cross carried him through smoke when the convoy was hit. Said you were the reason he came home." Thaddeus didn't move for several seconds, the memory slamming into his chest like a buried mine. He hadn't thought about that day in years. He'd written it off as another mission, another piece of chaos. But hearing her say it turned the ghosts tangible. "You don't owe me anything," he muttered, standing and throwing another log on the fire. "Saving people didn't make me any better than the next killer." "Maybe," she said faintly, "but it makes you the only kind of man I trust right now." Her words landed like a hand on his shoulder light, but impossible to ignore. Thaddeus turned toward Harlem, who had gently shifted closer to the door, ears pricked. "You hear that too?" he whispered. The dog's tail flicked once, then froze. Outside, through the constant whisper of the wind, there was something else. A faint metallic click, like metal brushing against bark. Not loud, but intentional. Thaddeus grabbed his rifle from where it leaned near the wall, checked the chamber, and moved silently toward the small window. The forest was a blur of shadows and mist. Nothing moved. Yet the unease didn't fade. He'd been hunted before, and that sixth sense never lied. "Stay down," he murmured to Calla, and she obeyed, instantly pulling Maris close. Harlem crept beside him, muscles coiled. Another sound came, a quick rhythmic rustle moving parallel to the cabin, then stopping dead. Whoever was out there knew how to move quiet. Thaddeus turned the lantern low, casting the cabin in half-darkness. The feeling of being watched pressed heavy on the air. Minutes dragged, but nothing came. Eventually, the sounds faded into the distance, swallowed by the surf and wind. When he finally allowed himself to breathe, Cala's eyes were wide with fear. "They found us," she whispered. Thaddeus shook his head. "Not yet," he said. "But they will." She clutched the blanket, her voice shaking. "Then why stay? You could walk away." "Because he won't stop with you," Thaddeus said. "People like Price don't stop until someone stops them." He reached for his jacket and slung it over his shoulders. Dawn came slow and gray. The mist outside the cabin thick enough to erase the horizon, and Thaddeus Cross was already moving before the first light broke the sky. The small fire had died down to a dull orange glow, its warmth fading just as fast as the illusion of safety. He dozed in the chair near the door, rifle across his knees, but he hadn't truly slept. Every instinct in him hummed like a live wire tuned to every creak of wood, every whisper of wind against the logs. When Harlem stirred and stretched, the faint click of his claws against the floor was enough to pull Thaddeus to full awareness. The dog looked towards the door, ears erect, head tilted. "Easy," Thaddeus murmured. "We're still breathing. Let's keep it that way." Cala Wynne was still asleep, her fever high but steady, a thin sheen of sweat glistening along her temple. The little girl Maris lay curled against Harlem's flank, her small hand gripping his fur like a lifeline. Thaddeus crouched beside them and pressed his palm gently against Cala's forehead. Too hot. The infection was worsening. He'd seen fevers like this before in field hospitals and desert tents where antibiotics ran out long before hope did. She needed real medicine, not just boiled water and faith. He reached for his duffel, unzipped it, and paused. At the bottom, wrapped in faded green canvas, sat the trauma kit he'd sworn never to open again. He'd packed it the day he left the Navy, telling himself that carrying it was superstition, not survival. It held pieces of the man he'd been field dressing, sutures, morphine, the smell of antiseptic, and regret. His hand hovered over it for a moment, the old ghosts whispering that saving one more life meant reopening every scar he'd buried. Then he exhaled hard and unrolled it on the floor. Inside, every tool gleamed cold and familiar. "Guess we're doing this again," he muttered. Harlem watched silently as Thaddeus filled a small tin with water from his canteen, heated it over the fire, and mixed a measured powder of antibiotics from the kit's deepest pouch. He cleaned a needle, sterilized it, and slid it carefully into Cala's arm, finding the vein on the first try. The clear fluid began to drip slowly, the rhythmic beat of salvation ticking through the silence. She stirred, groaning softly, her body twitching with pain, and he steadied her shoulder. "It's just medicine," he said, voice calm. "Breathe through it." Her eyes fluttered open for a moment, catching his face in the dim light. "You said you wouldn't get involved," she murmured weakly. "You're right," he said quietly. "I lied." When the IV bag was nearly empty, he checked her pulse, weak but holding. The sweat on her skin had changed, less heat, more fight. He tore a strip of cloth and wiped her brow. Harlem shifted near the door again, growling low. Thaddeus looked up sharply. "What is it?" The dog's growl deepened into a vibration that filled the air, his fur bristling, his eyes fixed on something beyond the small window. Thaddeus set the IV down and grabbed his rifle, moving to the slit in the curtain. Outside, the forest was motionless, just fog and silence, but he trusted Harlem's instincts more than his own sight. He stepped to the door, cracked it open an inch, and felt the faintest draft of air slide across his face. It carried a smell that didn't belong here, burnt fuel, human scent, and something metallic, gun oil. His jaw tightened. He stepped outside, Harlem at his side, the rifle loose in his hands. The world was muffled sound trapped in the mist. He crouched near the edge of the clearing and scanned the soft earth. Harlem moved forward, nose, low tail stiff, then stopped beside a patch of soil near a tree root. The prints were faint, but clear, a man's boots, heavy-treaded, recent, less than an hour old. Thaddeus's gut twisted. They were already closing in. He crouched lower and followed the direction of the tracks, counting the stride length. 3 men, he muttered, maybe 4, moving fast. Harlem let out a soft chuff, confirming it with his body language, head turning slightly east toward the slope that led back to the beach. "They're circling," Thaddeus whispered. He scanned the tree line again, looking for movement. Nothing. Whoever they were trained. They were moving like hunters. He backed away, keeping low, and returned to the cabin. Inside, the air felt heavier, as though the walls themselves were bracing for what was coming. Calla had stirred again, her voice hoarse. "They're here, aren't they?" she whispered. "Not yet," Thaddeus said, closing the door quietly. "But soon. We can't run," she rasped. "Not like this. Then we make them think we did," he said. "You rest. I'll take care of it." She opened her mouth to argue, but he gave her a look that froze the words in her throat. She nodded once and lay back down, her eyes glassy with fever, but still defiant. Thaddeus turned to Maris. The girl had woken, her expression wary, but calm, the kind of calm that came from a child who'd seen too much already. "Listen to me," he said softly. "You do everything Harlem tells you, all right?" She nodded. "Good. He's smarter than both of us." That earned the faintest flicker of a smile, quick as lightning and gone just as fast. Thaddeus knelt beside Harlem and scratched behind his ear. "We're doing this old school," he said. Quiet, clean, controlled. The dog's ears twitched once in acknowledgement. Thaddeus loaded a fresh magazine into his rifle, checked the chamber, and positioned himself near the narrow side window that faced the clearing. He could see the outline of the trail where the prints had come from, the fog curling like smoke over the ground. Every muscle in his body hummed with readiness. He could almost hear the rhythm of boots on soil, the steady breath of men moving as one. The only difference was that this time, he wasn't the one hunting. He was the wall, and he intended to hold. The minutes stretched long and brittle, each one adding weight to the silence. Then far off came the faint click of a safety being disengaged. Thaddeus froze. It came again, closer, this time, followed by the soft crunch of boots. He could feel Harlem's tension rising beside him, the dog's growl low and steady, ready for his command. "Wait," Thaddeus whispered, "not yet." Shadows began to form in the mist outside, tall, deliberate, precise. Whoever they were, they knew how to move. They spread out, covering angles, watching for traps. The leader's hand lifted, signaling. That small, sharp movement told Thaddeus everything he needed to know. These weren't local hunters or rangers. They were professionals. And the only professionals operating this deep under the radar belonged to Jonas Price. Thaddeus breathed out once, slow and controlled, and his mind shifted gears from survival to strategy. He'd spent years training for this moment, years pretending those reflexes didn't still live in him. But war didn't leave men. It waited inside them. He sighted down the barrel, finger steady on the trigger heart, beating with the cold rhythm of precision. "Come on," he whispered to himself. "Step closer." But before he could act, Harlem moved suddenly toward the corner of the cabin, nose pressed against the floorboards. The dog let out a short bark, sharp and alert. The first shot tore through the mist outside, echoing like thunder against the trees. Thaddeus Cross ducked instinctively, pulling Harlem down with a low command, his movements sharp and silent as the bullet splintered the wooden frame of the window inches from his head. He returned fire without hesitation, 3 controlled bursts aimed low to keep them pinned. The forest exploded into motion, voices calling out, branches snapping, boots pounding on the wet ground. He'd seen ambushes like this before, disciplined, well coordinated and deliberate. These weren't bounty hunters or amateurs. These were trained operators, Price's men. The realization was confirmation of what he'd feared. They'd been found. Smoke curled around the cabin as he reloaded and motioned for Calla to take Maris and crawl under the floor. She obeyed without question, her movement slow from fever, but determined, clutching her daughter tightly. Harlem stayed pressed to Thaddeus's side, the dog's low growl pulsing like the beat of a drum beneath the chaos. A flash of light erupted from the tree line, followed by another gunshot that shattered a lantern near the door. "You want to live," Thaddeus hissed to himself, grabbing the second rifle from his pack. "Then don't think, just move." He ducked behind the table, aimed through the shattered window, and fired twice more. One figure dropped to a knee, another dove behind a fallen log. Silence returned in jagged breaths, broken only by the faint hum of wind through the chimney. Then a voice came from the trees, steady controlled the tone of command. "Cross," the man shouted. "We know you're in there. We've got orders not to kill unless you make us. Stand down and you walk away breathing." Thaddeus froze. They knew his name. His finger hovered on the trigger, mind racing. "Who sent you?" He called back, his voice low and calm. Price, the voice replied without hesitation. "You're protecting government property. Hand them over, and this ends clean." Government property. The words made his stomach turn. He glanced toward the floorboards where Calla and Maris hid, his jaw tightening. He knew propaganda when he heard it, the kind that disguised murder as procedure. "You tell Price?" Thaddeus said, his tone like gravel. He just declared war on the wrong man. He switched positions, crawling along the wall toward the back exit. Harlem followed closely, muscles coiled and ready. Thaddeus peeked through a crack in the wood and spotted the faint gleam of a scope catching dawnlight 50 yards out. "Sniper." He exhaled and whispered, "We're boxed in." The dog gave a low rumble in reply. He thought fast, scanned the floor, and remembered the tunnel Harlem had discovered earlier. "Smart boy," he muttered. He lifted the loose planks carefully and signaled for Calla to emerge. She crawled out, clutching Maris, her face pale and drenched in sweat. "We're leaving," he whispered. "Now." "They'll see us," she rasped. "Not if they're looking the wrong way." He threw a smoke canister toward the shattered window. It detonated with a hiss, filling the room and clearing their scent trail. He lowered them one by one into the narrow tunnel beneath the cabin and handed her a flashlight. "Follow it to the ridge," he said. "You'll come out near the creek bed. Stay low and wait for me." Calla hesitated. "What about you? I'll make sure they stop following." She looked at him like she wanted to argue, but knew better. "You can't fight them all." "Watch me," he said, and sealed the hatch. As the smoke thickened, he moved through it like a ghost, switching positions, firing once towards the tree line to draw attention, then slipping out the back. He could feel Harlem at his side, shadow silent, every movement precise. They weaved through brush and fallen trees, circling behind the advancing men. He heard their radios crackle, static-laced voices barking orders. 2 targets confirmed. The woman sick. The kid's priority. His pulse spiked. Price wasn't after Calla. He wanted the child. Whatever truth Calla carried in that satchel was only half the story. They reached a ridge overlooking the clearing, and Thaddeus crouched low, rifle steady. Through the fog, he could see one of the men, the leader, holding a handheld device glowing with a signal readout. They weren't tracking sight or sound. They were tracking heat signatures. His heat signature. He had 30 seconds before they locked his position. "Harlem," he whispered, pointing down slope. "Fetch." The dog darted forward, silently grabbing a stick soaked in gasoline from the fire pit, carrying it toward the tree line. When the dog dropped it into the undergrowth, Thaddeus fired once at the embers, igniting a sudden blaze that consumed the brush in bright flame. The mercenaries scattered, shouting. He used the chaos to retreat toward the creek, his lungs burning, his heartbeat loud enough to drown out thought. He reached the tunnel exit just as Calla and Maris emerged into daylight. She looked at him like he was made of smoke and fury. "You're bleeding," she whispered, pointing to his arm. He glanced down, grazed nothing more. "Not mine," he lied. "Keep moving." They followed the creek downstream, the water freezing around their boots. The sound of pursuit faded behind them, replaced by the constant rhythm of the current. When they finally stopped to breathe beneath a rocky outcrop, Calla leaned against the wall, coughing hard. Thaddeus tore a strip from his sleeve and pressed it against her temple to catch the sweat. "You need to tell me everything he said." She looked at him through half-lidded eyes. "You wouldn't believe me. Try me." Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Jonas Price's fortune isn't built on contracts. It's built on people, on soldiers, on us. He's been funding illegal experiments since the end of the war. Neurological conditioning, behavioral rewriting. He uses veterans like test subjects. I found medical files, hundreds of them. Most of the men died. The ones who didn't disappeared." Her eyes glistened as she looked at him. "Your name was on the list." The word struck like a physical blow. "That's not possible," he said, shaking his head. "I was never part of that program." "Yes, you were," she said softly. "Not as a test subject, as proof that his formula worked. You were the control, his perfect soldier. He altered your record to make it look clean." Thaddeus felt the air tighten around him. His breath caught between disbelief and anger. He thought back to his last deployment, the orders that hadn't made sense, the mission reports that vanished, the discharge that came without explanation. He remembered blackouts he'd ignored, gaps in memory he'd blamed on trauma. All those years of silence, of isolation, and suddenly they had a name. Price. "You're saying I'm part of his research," he said quietly. "That everything I've done since was influenced," Calla finished. "He's been watching his creations in the wild." Thaddeus stared into the distance, jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "Then he's going to regret leaving one alive." Calla's breathing slowed, her fever dipping again. Harlem pressed close to Maris, the girl leaning against his flank, whispering something only he could hear. The dog's ears twitched, his tail sweeping once across the dirt. Thaddeus glanced at them both, something fragile flickering in his chest. He had spent years running from the past, but now it had come crawling out of the dark, wearing a human name. The soldier he'd buried was awake again, not for revenge, but for protection. They moved through the forest like ghosts, their breaths shallow in the damp morning air, the fog curling between the trees as if trying to erase their path. The creek beside them whispered quietly, carrying the cold truth of the night behind them, and the smell of smoke from the burned cabin still clung faintly to their clothes. Thaddeus Cross led the way, rifle slung tight across his chest, his sharp eyes scanning the tree line with the restless precision of a man who had been hunted before. Calla Wynne limped beside him, her strength slowly returning, though her fever had left her pale and trembling. The little girl Maris walked between them, clutching Harlem's thick fur like it was a promise of safety. The dog moved with the silent grace of instinct, pausing often to listen to smell, to sense what human eyes could not. Every so often, Thaddeus would stop and crouch to check for tracks, wiping out the faint marks of their passing. He knew Price's men were close. Trained mercenaries didn't quit until someone called them off or someone died. The three of them had neither luxury nor backup. They were on their own. As they reached the narrow ridge that sloped down toward the valley, the air grew colder and sharper. Calla pulled her jacket tighter and asked between shallow breaths, "This place we're going, what is it exactly?" Thaddeus didn't look at her when he answered. "A training outpost, off the grid, Ash Hollow. It was meant for black operations, a ghost site for men who didn't exist." "You built it?" she asked. "Helped," he said. "Taught others how to disappear there. Nobody finds it unless they already know where to look. And Price," she pressed. "He'll look everywhere else first," Thaddeus said. "That buys us time." They continued along the ridge, the sound of their footsteps swallowed by pine needles. Hours passed and the forest began to thin, giving way to old dirt roads covered with moss. Maris stumbled once and Harlem steadied her by pressing his body gently against her side. Thaddeus turned, crouched down, and adjusted the strap of her small backpack. "You holding up, kid?" he asked softly. She nodded, but kept her gaze on the ground. "You talk much," he tried again. "She hasn't since we left Seattle," Calla said quietly. Not a word. Thaddeus studied the girl for a moment longer, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of driftwood carved into the rough shape of a dog. Here, he said. Made it when I was waiting on the beach. Guess it belongs to you now. Maris took it without a sound, her eyes flickering briefly toward him, then down to the carving. Harlem wagged his tail once, brushing her hand with his nose, and she smiled faintly, the first real flicker of childhood Thaddeus had seen in her. But the quiet didn't last. A strange metallic gleam caught his attention when Maris adjusted the chain around her neck. He noticed the locket, a small silver heart, dull from age, but sturdy. Where'd you get that? He asked. Calla frowned. That her mother gave it to her. Why, Thaddeus reached gently toward it. Can I? Maris hesitated, then nodded. He turned the locket over, and something felt wrong about its weight, too heavy for jewelry. He pressed a small indentation near the hinge, and the heart split open to reveal a micro flash drive embedded inside, the kind used by military contractors for encrypted data. Calla's breath caught. That's it, she whispered. That's the copy. I thought I lost it during the escape. Price's whole operation is on here, Thaddeus asked, tucking it into his chest pocket. Everything she said. Contracts, test subjects, political payoffs. If it's decrypted and released, it ends him. Then we protect it with our lives, Thaddeus said. And we don't stop until it's safe. They pushed forward through the valley, following an old fire road that wound upward through the forest. The fog began to thin, revealing streaks of pale sunlight cutting through the branches. It almost felt peaceful until Harlem stopped dead, his tail-stiffened head snapping toward the slope above them. Thaddeus froze, instantly scanning the ridge with his rifle raised. Down, he whispered. Calla pulled Maris behind a fallen log. The forest went silent, then it came a faint click, sharp and deliberate, followed by the whistling crack of a rifle shot. The bullet tore through the bark inches from Maris's head. She screamed, dropping flat as splinters flew. Thaddeus rolled behind cover, firing 2 quick bursts toward the ridge. Harlem lunged sideways, tackling Maris down and covering her with his body as another shot split the air, grazing his flank. No, Calla cried, but Thaddeus grabbed her wrist. Stay down! He fired again, aiming toward the flash of muzzle light halfway up the slope. The figure ducked, vanishing into the fog. The echo of footsteps retreated fast, too fast for pursuit. Thaddeus stayed low until the forest fell quiet again, then crawled toward Harlem. The dog whimpered softly, but stood, blood matting the fur along his ribs. Thaddeus pressed a hand to the wound, checking it carefully. Through and through, he muttered. You'll live. Harlem licked his arm, once eyes steady and loyal. Maris clung to his neck, her small shoulders shaking. He saved her, Calla whispered, voice breaking. He saved her life. Thaddeus nodded, throat tight. He's done that more times than I can count. He tore another strip from his sleeve and wrapped the wound, working quickly. The bleeding slowed, and Harlem sat still, stoic, as if understanding that stillness was survival. When the job was done, Thaddeus wiped his hands on the dirt and glanced back toward the ridge. They're moving faster than I expected, he said. Means they've got a tracker. How do we stop them? Calla asked. We don't, he said. We outrun them. He rose to his feet, slinging the rifle across his shoulder, and motioned for them to move. They cut through the trees, crossing a shallow stream that ran along the base of a ravine. The sound of rushing water drowned out their footsteps. Thaddeus checked his compass and adjusted their course northwest. If we make it past the canyon by nightfall, we'll reach Ash Hollow by dawn, he said. You sure it's still standing? Calla asked. If it isn't, we build something that is. They walked for hours, Harlem limping slightly, but refusing to fall behind. The forest changed around them, the trees giving way to jagged cliffs and open meadows blanketed in fog. When they finally stopped to rest beneath an old stone archway, the remnants of an abandoned lookout, Thaddeus set down his pack and took out the locket again. We need to know what's on this, he said. If Price's people are willing to kill a child for it, there's more here than blackmail. It's encrypted, Calla said. It'll need a secure terminal. There's one at Ash Hollow, he said, buried deep in the command center. If the generator still runs, we'll use it. She looked at him with something between fear and admiration. You've been preparing for this kind of war your whole life, haven't you? He shook his head. No, I've been trying to forget it. Harlem lay down beside Maris, his head resting on her knees. The girl traced a finger over his fur, whispering softly to him, as if apologizing for what he'd endured. The dog blinked slowly, pressing his nose into her palm, forgiving her with the quiet grace only animals possess. Thaddeus watched them, something unspoken tightening in his chest. You know, he said, his voice low, he doesn't just protect because I trained him to. He does it because he chooses to. Calla looked at the dog, then at Thaddeus. Maybe that's what makes him better than most men. The climb into the high valley took the better part of a day, the three of them moving through a cold, white silence, broken only by the crunch of frost beneath their boots and Harlem's soft panting. The fog had thinned, revealing the spine of the Olympic Mountains, stretching like a broken ribcage across the horizon. Calla's breath came in shallow bursts, but her eyes never left the winding trail ahead. Maris walked close to Harlem, one hand on his collar for balance, the other gripping the driftwood carving Thaddeus had given her. The dog's wound had stopped bleeding, but each step drew a soft grunt from his throat, a reminder that courage always costs something. Thaddeus led them through a maze of stone switchbacks and fallen pines, his thoughts fixed on the facility hidden beyond the ridge Ash Hollow, the Ghost Base. It had been built during his final deployment, designed for off-grid recovery and covert reprogramming of soldiers deemed unfit for return. He hadn't realized until now how deeply Price's influence must have reached, but if Ash Hollow still stood, it would hold both answers and weapons. The path narrowed, cutting across a steep drop. A rusted sign half buried in snow caught Thaddeus's eye. Authorized personnel only. The lettering was faded, but the warning was clear. They had found it. A cold wind funneled through the gorge, carrying the faint metallic tang of old wiring and diesel fuel. Smell that, Thaddeus murmured. Calla nodded, her expression wary. That's not nature. No, he said, scanning the slope. It's power. Someone's been running a generator. He raised his fist, a silent signal, and Harlem stopped, instantly, muscles tightening. The dog's ears swiveled forward, tracking something unseen. Then from somewhere beyond the ridge came a faint rhythmic hum, the unmistakable pulse of active machinery. Ash Hollow was alive. Thaddeus motioned for silence and crouched low, leading them toward a cluster of rocks overlooking the entrance. Below, buried into the hillside like a scar, was a large steel door flanked by concrete barriers. The surrounding trees had been cleared recently. Snow was trampled vehicle tracks etched deep into the mud. They beat us here, he whispered. Calla's face went pale. Price, or what's left of his army, Thaddeus said. He studied the tracks more closely, noting their width and pattern. No tanks, civilian trucks, supply-grade tires, meaning, she asked. Meaning they're not here to destroy it, he said grimly. They're using it. They circled wide, keeping low until they reached a secondary tunnel on the far side of the hill. The entrance was partially collapsed, but Thaddeus remembered its design, an emergency maintenance shaft. He used his knife to pry open a rusted hatch, revealing a dark passage that smelled of earth and iron. Stay close, he whispered. They descended single file into the darkness, the only light coming from Thaddeus's flashlight, its beam cutting across corroded pipes and broken cables. The air was thick with the scent of oil and dust. As they moved deeper, faded stenciled words appeared on the wall. Unit 7 personnel PSYOPs. What kind of place was this? Calla asked softly. A lab disguised as a barracks, Thaddeus replied. They said it was for training rehabilitation, but it was really for control. The tunnel opened into a wide corridor lined with steel doors. Some hung open, revealing rooms with overturned beds and shattered monitors. Others remained sealed lights, still flickering weakly behind frosted glass. Harlem sniffed the floor, growling low. Then a sound echoed through the hall, a faint metallic clang. followed by a slow creak. Someone else was here. Thaddeus raised his rifle and motioned them back. "Whoever's alive down here knows this place better than we do," he whispered. "Let me go first." He moved toward the sound booth, silent on the concrete. The corridor ended at a large reinforced door marked Command. A soft amber glow spilled from the cracks beneath it. He took a breath, turned the handle, and pushed it open. The light hit him first, soft yellow human. Then came the voice. "You always did show up late, Cross." Thaddeus froze. The man standing by the console was tall, broad-shouldered, with salt gray hair cropped to regulation length. His uniform, though unmarked, was spotless. His left hand rested casually on a pistol, his right on the control panel. Monroe, Thaddeus said slowly, disbelief grinding through his tone. "You're supposed to be dead. So are you," the man replied with a faint smirk. "But here we are." Calla stepped into the doorway, her face pale. "You know him," she whispered. "He was my commanding officer," Thaddeus said. "He trained half the men Price bought." Monroe's eyes flicked to her, then to Maris, and something cold and calculating flickered behind his calm expression. "You've brought trouble to my doorstep, Cross," he said. "You always did have a gift for that. You're working for Price." Thaddeus said, more statement than question. "You think I didn't notice the vehicles outside?" Monroe shrugged lightly. "The world changed, son. Price funds what's left of our unit. The government forgot us long ago, but he didn't. He pays well, and he understands loyalty." "Loyalty," Thaddeus growled. "You're selling children. You're running his experiments here." "I'm ensuring survival," Monroe said, evenly. "The experiments are the future. You of all people should understand Price's methods built men like you, controlled, efficient, perfect." "No," Thaddeus said, stepping forward, rifle raised. "They built ghosts, empty shells that don't remember who they were before they started killing. And yet," Monroe said with a thin smile, "you're still very good at it." The room tensed like a drawn bow. Harlem growled low, his hackles rising. Calla edged back, shielding Maris with her body. Thaddeus's trigger finger twitched, but Monroe lifted a small device from the console and pressed a button. Instantly, the base came alive, lights flickering on motors, humming steel doors sliding shut throughout the complex. "I wouldn't do that," Monroe said calmly. "You're surrounded. My men have the exits covered. You start a firefight, and your little family dies with you." "She's not my family," Thaddeus said, voice tight. "Not yet," Monroe countered, "but she's made you weak enough to think she could be." "You don't know a damn thing about me," Thaddeus said. "I know everything about you," Monroe replied. "You're still following orders you don't understand. Price didn't erase your record, Cross. He rewrote it. You were the prototype, the perfect obedience test. The trigger phrase is still buried in your subconscious." The words landed like a blade. Thaddeus took a step back, shaking his head. "You're lying." "Am I?" Monroe tilted his head. "Do you remember Cobble the alleyway? The word that stopped you from pulling the trigger?" Thaddeus's breath caught. There had been a mission one he'd buried so deep it came only in nightmares. A voice had stopped him mid-fire. A single word he'd never told anyone. Monroe's eyes gleamed. "That's what Price gave you, a leash you never felt. You think you've been free all these years. You've just been off duty." Thaddeus felt the world tilt, memories slamming through his skull. Brief flashes of chaos, commands, the sound of static in his ear that wasn't radio at all. He clenched his jaw, forcing the storm back. "You can't control me anymore, we'll see," Monroe said softly, pressing another button. The hum of the lights deepened, and a faint electric vibration filled the air. Thaddeus's vision blurred for a split second, just enough for Harlem to move. The dog lunged between them, snarling, breaking Monroe's line of sight. The device clattered from his hand. Thaddeus fired once the bullet grazing Monroe's shoulder. The older man stumbled back with a curse. "Run," Thaddeus barked. Calla grabbed Maris and bolted for the hall. Harlem backed out slowly, teeth bared, as Thaddeus threw the rifle strap over his shoulder and followed. The alarm blared through the steel corridors like a war cry, red lights pulsing off the walls as Thaddeus Cross sprinted through the twisting tunnels of Ash Hollow. His boots hit metal grates slick with condensation, his breath coming in controlled bursts, his eyes scanning every corner for movement. Behind him, Calla Wynne clutched Maris to her chest, her lips cracked and pale, her body shaking from fever and exhaustion, but her resolve iron strong. Harlem ran ahead, his paws slamming against the concrete with the power of a storm, his ears flattened nose guiding them through the labyrinth of decay. The base was alive now, doors slamming shut, vents hissing open hydraulic pistons, sealing corridors like a giant mechanical lung closing in around them. Somewhere above Monroe Vance's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, calm and measured. "You can't outrun the truth, Cross. This place was built to break men stronger than you. You know that because you helped design it." Thaddeus didn't respond. His focus was pure and sharp, stripped of emotion. But beneath that discipline pulsed something deeper: fear for the people behind him. Grief for what Monroe's words had started to unravel inside him. Left tunnel, he barked, and they veered hard, the metallic echo of boots chasing them close behind. He slammed his fist against a control panel, and the emergency bulkhead slammed shut, just as 3 of Monroe's soldiers appeared at the far end, their shouts cut off by a thunderous clang. Calla stumbled against the wall, coughing hard, her voice barely a whisper. "We can't keep running forever. We don't need forever," Thaddeus said. "We just need the generator room. If I can cut power to the lockdown, we can get out." Maris clung to her mother's coat, her small eyes wide but steady, her faith anchored entirely in Harlem, who stopped to check every doorway before they moved. The smell of burning insulation filled the air as sparks rained from the ceiling. The facility was old, but its systems were lethal, built to trap intruders and purge them. They turned another corner and entered a wide chamber filled with old computer terminals. Rows of monitors flickered to life as they passed, each one showing fragments of surveillance footage, grainy images of soldiers training medical procedures, electrode screams. Calla froze when she saw her own face on one of the screens labeled Subject D17, Wynne Calla. Thaddeus' stomach dropped when the next feed showed his own image, younger, standing in the same hallway years ago. The caption beneath read, "Prototype 0 observation active." He smashed the monitor with the butt of his rifle. "This is what he's been doing," Calla whispered. "He's been watching us both for years. He's been rewriting us," Thaddeus said. "Every decision I made after deployment, every nightmare, every time, I couldn't remember how I got from one city to the next. It wasn't trauma. It was programming." Monroe's voice returned this time, closer, fed through the speakers with an edge of triumph. "That's right, Cross. The control sequence was never meant to end. Price perfected it, and you're living proof. You think you escaped the leash, but it's still around your throat. You're one phrase away from being mine again." "You'll never control me," Thaddeus growled. "You already are," Monroe replied. "You came here because I wanted you to. You led the package, Motherchild, and Data right back into the hive, all according to design." "He's lying," Calla said, her voice trembling but defiant. "Don't let him get in your head." But Thaddeus wasn't sure anymore. The memories clawed at him, missions that had ended too perfectly, survival that felt too lucky, moments when his body moved faster than thought, obeying commands that came from nowhere. "The generator room's below," he said, forcing his mind back into focus. "We end this before he does." They descended the spiral staircase into the sub-level, the air turning hot and metallic. The walls shook with the hum of turbines buried deep beneath the mountain. Harlem growled softly as the shadows thickened. The lower level stretched out before them, an enormous cavern filled with catwalks, pipes, and glowing control panels. Thaddeus recognized the design instantly. It was the beating heart of the base, a fusion of military engineering and corporate greed. "Stay behind me," he ordered. "Don't touch anything." Calla nodded and held Maris close, her body swaying with fatigue. As they crossed the catwalk, Harlem suddenly stopped barking, once a sharp, urgent warning. Thaddeus froze. A faint vibration pulsed beneath his boots, followed by a mechanical click. Back he shouted, pulling Calla down just as a section of the catwalk exploded. The blast hurled them backward, flames cutting through the steel walkway, the air filled with smoke and debris. When Thaddeus looked up, the middle span of the bridge was gone. Twisted metal dangling over a pit of fire. Harlem was on the other side, standing between Maris and a flickering red sensor embedded in the wall. "Trip mine," Thaddeus said through gritted teeth. "It's motion sensitive." Maris started to step forward, but Harlem barked sharply, holding her in place. "No," Thaddeus shouted. "Don't move." The girl froze, tears streaking through the soot on her face. The red light blinked faster, the soft whine of detonation filling the air. Harlem's gaze met Thaddeus's across the gap, steady knowing. Then he turned and lunged toward the device, his teeth clamping down on the exposed wiring, just as the explosion ripped through the corridor. The blast threw a wave of heat and light across the chamber, the shockwave knocking Thaddeus off his feet. When he scrambled up, coughing through the smoke, the catwalk on the far side was gone. All that remained was fire and twisted steel and silence. Harlem Maris screamed, her voice shattering. Thaddeus grabbed her, pulling her into his arms, his own voice raw. "Don't look!" But she did, and what she saw would stay with her forever. The blackened collar lying near the wreckage, the faint smell of burnt fur drifting through the air. Calla fell to her knees, sobbing into her hands. Thaddeus couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The dog had been more than a companion. He had been the last piece of humanity that tethered Thaddeus to the world, and now that link was gone. Monroe's voice came again, soft and venomous. "It was always going to cost you something, Cross. Price called it necessary sacrifice. I call it progress." Thaddeus's vision tunneled fury, turning his grief into pure focus. "You killed the wrong soldier," he said quietly, his tone deathly calm. "You think this breaks me. It makes me." He looked at Calla and Maris, their faces lit by firelight, and the decision crystallized in his chest. "Get to the exit shaft. It's 2 corridors north. Wait for my signal." "What are you going to do?" Calla asked. "Finish what I started," he said. He turned back toward the inferno, grabbed the fallen rifle, and began climbing through the debris. His body screamed in protest, but the pain grounded him. Every step was a vow to the dog that had saved the child, to the people he had failed, to every name lost to Price's greed. He reached the far side of the catwalk and dropped into a maintenance crawl space that led straight toward the control hub. The corridor shook from distant explosions as Monroe's men fought the spreading fire. The elevator clawed its way up the narrow shaft, groaning under its own age as sparks rained from the cables above. The mountain shuddered around them, a low rolling thunder that spoke of collapsing tunnels and failing supports. Thaddeus Cross stood with his back to the wall, rifle slung across his shoulder, his face streaked with soot and blood. He could still smell Harlem's burnt fur in the folds of his clothes, could still hear the echo of that final bark before the world turned to fire. Beside him, Calla Wynne clutched Maris close, both trembling under a blanket of ash. The child's small hand gripped the driftwood carving of the dog so tightly her knuckles were white. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. When the elevator doors finally creaked open, the night air hit them like a cold slap, fresh, sharp, alive. They stumbled out onto a ridge overlooking the dark valley below. The forest stretched endlessly under the moonlight, and far behind them, the mountain glowed faintly, smoke curling into the sky like the breath of something ancient dying. "We made it," Calla whispered, her voice trembling. Thaddeus didn't answer. His eyes stayed locked on the horizon. "We're not done." He crouched beside a fallen log, checking the gear. The flash drive from the locket was still tucked against his chest, warm from his body heat. It was their last proof, their last weapon. "We head west," he said. "There's an extraction point 5 miles out. I can get us across the Sound before sunrise." And then she asked. "Then we expose him," Thaddeus said. But even as he spoke, the forest betrayed them. A faint hum split the silence, low and mechanical, followed by the shimmer of distant headlights weaving through the trees below. Calla's breath caught. "No," she whispered. "They can't still be alive." "They are," Thaddeus said grimly. "And they've got ground vehicles. Move." They descended into the forest, staying low, using shadows as cover. The smell of diesel and ozone grew stronger as the vehicles drew closer. Thaddeus pushed them forward, keeping one hand on the child's shoulder, the other on his weapon. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but rest was a luxury long buried with Harlem. They reached the tree line near the creek when a voice cut through the darkness, amplified by a nearby speaker, cold, familiar, and dripping with satisfaction. "You always did overestimate Firecross. You think a few explosions can erase a program built on control." Thaddeus froze. The voice was unmistakable. "Monroe Vance. He's alive," Calla breathed horror in her tone. The sound came from an armored vehicle rolling slowly through the clearing, floodlights sweeping the woods. Standing atop it, gripping the rail like a preacher at a pulpit, was Monroe, blood staining his shoulder. His uniform scorched, but intact, his expression calm as ever. "You did well," Monroe said. "Price will be pleased. He wanted you back, and here you are, delivering yourself to us like a loyal dog returning home." Thaddeus stepped into view, weapon raised. "I'm not his anything." Monroe smiled faintly. "You always misunderstand purpose for freedom." Behind him, the rear doors of the vehicle opened, and a figure emerged, a tall man in a charcoal overcoat, silver hair gleaming under the lights, his movements precise and deliberate. Jonas Price, the man himself. He looked more like a senator than a criminal, his calm so complete it felt rehearsed. "Mr. Cross," Price said smoothly, "you've cost me a great deal of time and money, but I must admit your resilience fascinates me. You weren't meant to survive Ash Hollow, but survival can be useful." Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "You sent soldiers after a woman and a child. You turned soldiers into lab rats. Useful isn't the word I'd use." Price tilted his head. "I see Calla made it as well." "You've met my daughter, I take it?" The words landed like shrapnel. Calla went rigid. What Price smiled faintly, his tone almost gentle. "You didn't know your mother kept my name from you for good reason. I was not the husband type. But I always make provisions for what's mine. You, my dear, and that little girl you're clutching so tightly." Calla stumbled back, her face pale. "You're lying. You think I'd bother," Price said. "Maris is the heir to every company I own, every contract tied to her bloodline. She's the only one who can legally unlock the inheritance when she turns 21. That's why I needed her back, not to harm her, to preserve her." Thaddeus felt the world tilt, fury and disbelief mixing into something sharp. "You built an empire on dead soldiers, and now you're using a child as collateral. You're filth." "Filth doesn't build futures," Price said evenly. "It builds legacies." Monroe stepped forward, rifle in hand. Hand over the drive cross. "You're surrounded. You can't win." Thaddeus's gaze flicked toward the tree line, 6 men in tactical gear, 2 more flanking with drones overhead. No way out, but he didn't lower his weapon. "You think I'll give you what's left of Harlem's sacrifice," he said quietly. "You'll have to kill me first." "I could," Monroe said, "but Price doesn't want you dead. He wants you back in the lab. You're the final link, the original template." Thaddeus spat on the ground. "Then he'll die disappointed." The air went still, and for a moment no one moved. Then from somewhere deep in the forest came the sound of an approaching engine, small, fast, reckless. A single light burst through the fog as an old ATV tore through the trees and skidded to a stop beside Thaddeus. A woman stepped off, covered in dust and sweat, carrying a shotgun. Her voice cut through the air like a blade. "You boys planning a family reunion without me?" Calla blinked, confused. "Who are you?" The woman smirked. "Name's Briggs. I used to run recon for Ash Hollow before your boyfriend here went AWOL. Guess I still know how to follow a signal." Thaddeus's eyes widened slightly. "You were supposed to be dead." "Yeah, well," Briggs said, "loading a shell, so were you. Now get the kid out of here." Monroe turned his rifle toward her, but before he could fire, she squeezed the trigger. The blast tore through the lead soldier's chest, sending chaos into motion. Thaddeus dove behind a fallen log, firing controlled bursts at the flanking team. Price ducked back behind the vehicle, shouting for restraint. "Don't kill him, he's worth more alive." The forest erupted in flashes of light and gunfire. Calla dragged Maris toward cover, shielding her with her body as bullets ripped through bark. Thaddeus moved like a shadow, switching positions, reloading in perfect rhythm. His mind had no room for thought, only purpose. Each target fell with precision, each movement fueled by grief, by Harlem, by every ghost of every soldier Price had turned into a tool. When the dust finally settled, the clearing was littered with silence. 2 of Price's men lay dead, the rest retreating toward the trucks. Monroe stood beside the armored vehicle, one arm bleeding heavily. Price emerged slowly, hands raised, a faint smirk still curving his lips. "You think this ends tonight," he said. "That drive is meaningless without decryption. You don't have the key." Calla straightened her voice, hoarse but steady. "You mean the biometric key you built into your air? The same one in her blood?" Price's face faltered for the first time. Calla's hands shook, but her eyes burned with resolve. "You made me your weapon once. You won't do the same to her," Calla, Price said quietly, almost pleading. "You don't understand what you're throwing away." "No," she said. "I finally do." She raised the pistol Thaddeus had given her and fired once. The bullet grazed Price's shoulder, sending him sprawling to the dirt. Monroe shouted and lunged, but Thaddeus was faster. He slammed into his former commander, the 2 men hitting the ground, hard, grappling for the rifle. Monroe's strength was still brutal, his face twisted with fury. "You think you can kill me, boy?" he hissed. "You owe me your life." The storm rolled in from the Pacific like a slow-moving wall of gray waves crashing against the cliffs below the old estate that crouched on the Washington coast. The house belonged to Jonas Price, though the name on the gate had been changed a dozen times in a dozen shell corporations. From a distance, it looked abandoned windows, boarded shutters hanging loose, but the faint orange glow of generators betrayed life within. Thaddeus Cross stood on the ridge overlooking the compound, rain dripping from his hair into the deep lines of his face. His hands were steady on the rifle, but his eyes held something colder than vengeance purpose. Behind him, Calla Wynne crouched beneath the cover of an old cedar, her arm around Maris. The girl was wrapped in Thaddeus's coat, the same olive-green jacket that had seen 2 wars and 1,000 ghosts. "You don't have to go in alone," Calla whispered. "You'll need time to decrypt the files. I can help." Thaddeus shook his head. "If Price sees you, he'll use you to finish what he started. He doesn't need both of us alive. And you think I'll let you die for me? Not for you," he said softly, glancing at the girl. "For her." Harlem's name was carved faintly on the driftwood. Maris clutched the carving, now smooth from her fingers. Thaddeus had kept that name alive because it anchored him to something that Price could never replicate: choice loyalty love. "She's the future," Thaddeus said. "Price builds obedience. We build truth." He turned toward the cliffside path, rain hammering the ground. "When the signal goes live, get to the beach. There's a boat hidden under the bluff. Head south. Don't look back." Calla gripped his sleeve, her voice breaking. "What happens when it goes live?" He looked down at her hand, then at her eyes. Everything changes. He disappeared into the storm before she could stop him. The estate loomed larger with each step, its once grand facade now eroded and covered in ivy. Thaddeus moved through the shadows, bypassing security drones with the precision of a man who had built the system himself. He slipped through a broken service door and entered a long hallway lined with portraits of men in suits. Price's proxies, ghosts of wealth and power. The hum of electricity grew louder as he descended into the sub-level, guided by faint light and memory. The deeper he went, the more the past closed in flashes of laboratories, the stench of antiseptic, the echo of soldiers screaming during tests. He reached the command center, a glass-walled chamber filled with humming servers and screens. Price was there, standing before the main console, hands clasped behind his back. His hair was damp from the rain, his expression unreadable. "You made good time," he said, calmly, not turning around. "I expected you to wait until dawn." "I've had enough waiting for one lifetime," Thaddeus said. Price faced him, then eyes bright and sharp. "You've come to kill me." That's the predictable choice. But predictable is why soldiers need guidance. You're proof that freedom without control is chaos, No, Thaddeus said, stepping closer. "Freedom is what happens when control dies." Price gestured to the screens. "Do you know what's on that drive? You're so proud of data, yes, but not just experiments. It's the architecture of a new world. Governments want it. Armies need it. A single command that makes men forget fear. Obedience that ends wars. Obedience ends humanity," Thaddeus said coldly. "You erase the souls of men to make better tools." Price smiled faintly. "Tools win wars, and you, my perfect soldier, are the proof of concept." Thaddeus's jaw tightened. "Not anymore." He raised the flash drive. "This ends tonight." Price's smirk faded. "You don't have the key." "No," Thaddeus said, reaching into his jacket. "But she does." He placed a small blood-stained patch from Maris's scraped hand onto the biometric reader. The machine blinked green. Price's composure cracked. "You wouldn't dare use her blood," he hissed. "You'll destroy everything, including yourself." "You destroyed enough already," Thaddeus said. He slotted the drive into the main port. The screens flared to life, rows of encrypted files streaming faster than the eye could follow. Price lunged forward, but Thaddeus leveled his rifle. "Stay back," he warned. "If you touch that console, I'll end you before the world does." "You think anyone will care?" Price snarled. "They'll bury this like they bury everything." Thaddeus pressed a final sequence on the terminal, initiating the upload. "Then I'll make it impossible to bury." The code on the screen shifted the drive, connecting to satellite relays Price himself had once used to hide his empire. Within moments, the transmission began sending every file, every secret, every name directly to news outlets, government servers, and civilian networks across the world. Price's voice rose with panic. "You fool! You'll expose yourself. You'll die in prison for this." Thaddeus stepped closer, his face inches from Price's. "Maybe, but I'll die free." Price swung at him, but Thaddeus caught his arm, slammed him against the console, and pinned him there. "You built your legacy on obedience," Thaddeus said, his voice low and steady. "So listen closely, Jonas, this is your last command. Live long enough to watch it burn." He released him and fired once into the power conduit. Sparks exploded the room, plunging into chaos. Fire leapt across the panels as systems overloaded. Price staggered back, coughing eyes wide with disbelief. "You can't stop evolution," he rasped. "You can only delay it." Thaddeus turned toward the door, heat licking at his back. "Then I'll delay it forever." He sprinted through the corridor as the base erupted behind him, the glass walls shattering from the pressure. The explosion tore through the estate, sending fire into the rain. Outside, Kala saw the flames and screamed his name, clutching Maris as debris rained down the hillside. A moment later, a shadow stumbled through the smoke, burned, bleeding, but alive. Thaddeus collapsed to his knees beside them, gasping for air. Kala caught him, tears streaking her face. "You did it," she whispered. "It's over." He shook his head weakly. "It's never over, but it's out there now. The truth." Maris pressed the driftwood carving into his palm. For Harlem, she whispered softly her first words since the cabin. Thaddeus smiled faintly, the sound of the storm fading behind her voice. "Yeah," he murmured, "for Harlem, for every man they tried to erase." His strength waned, but peace settled over him for the first time in years. The sirens from distant helicopters echoed faintly through the night searchlights sweeping the coastline. Go, he told Kala. Take her and go. Don't let them turn her into another weapon. She shook her head, crying. We're not leaving you. He touched her cheek gently. You already have what you need. Don't waste it on me. He looked toward the ocean where the waves reflected the fire behind them. I promised him I'd make it right. A promise is all a man has. His breathing slowed, the rain washing the blood from his hands. Kala held him until his eyes closed, her tears mixing with the storm. When the helicopters arrived, she and Maris were gone, their footprints leading down the cliff toward the boat Thaddeus had hidden. The broadcast continued for hours, every network on Earth flashing the same images, Price's experiments, his confessions, the faces of the men and women he'd destroyed. Governments fell, contracts dissolved. The obedience program was burned from the inside out. Somewhere across the world, veterans who'd been silenced for years saw their names cleared. In the aftermath, a memorial appeared on the same cliff where the estate once stood, a small wooden carving, weathered by sea and salt, depicting a shepherd dog watching over a man in uniform. Beneath it, a single line carved deep into the wood read, "Freedom isn't given, it's remembered." The end. If this story moved, you hit like and subscribe so more people can hear it too. Tell me in the comments what moment hit you hardest and where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one.